There are emotions that flare up inside you, strong, clear, unmistakable, but only for a moment. And then, almost instantly, they get smothered by a familiar reflex. You swallow them down. You smile. You keep silent, not because you don't know what to say, but because you've grown too used to keeping the peace, being agreeable, playing the role of the good woman. Throughout your life, society has taught you how to control your anger, not in the sense of understanding it, but in the sense of burying it. From the small reminders in childhood, don't be so grumpy, learn to tolerate, to the larger scripts. If you get angry, you're the one at fault. If you speak up, you'll be called difficult, troublesome. All of these things have formed an invisible script, directing how you behave, so subtly that even you might not notice it. But anger doesn't disappear, it simply transforms into anxiety, into chronic tension, into self-criticism, into that feeling of having to try so hard yet always feeling drained. Carl Jung called this the shadow of the soul, the part of our true self we've been forced to bury in order to become the pleasant version of ourselves that society desires. The question is, what happens if you stop? If you stop trying to please, stop suppressing, stop playing the role of the good woman? What happens if you let anger, the emotion you fear, avoid, become the compass guiding you back to yourself? The story that follows isn't just about anger. It's about the journey of freeing yourself from invisible rules, from the fear of judgment, toward becoming the fullest and truest version of who you are. Not by breaking everything down, but by understanding and reconnecting with the deepest emotions inside you, where anger is no longer the problem, but the guide. 1. Taught silence. When emotions are labeled too much, women are not born fearing their emotions. They learn it. They're taught, from the smallest moments in childhood, that anger, sadness, or any intense feeling is a sign of being overreactive, of making too big a deal. And from these gentle corrections, they begin an invisible training process where silence is encouraged as a mark of maturity. And strong emotions are labeled as too much, unpleasant. It's not that someone explicitly tells them, never get angry. No, the control over women's emotions is trained through seemingly harmless phrases like, don't make a fuss. Calm down. Why are you being so aggressive for a girl? Speak softly. Don't raise your voice like that. These words don't need to be harsh. They just need to be consistent, repeated over time, and that's enough to bury the natural instinct to resist. From there, anger, the primal, justified emotion, is pushed down, boxed in, turned into something not to be expressed, not because it's wrong, but because it makes others uncomfortable, not because women don't have the right to be angry, but because society tells them that when a woman gets angry, it's her problem, not the problem of whoever caused it. And what is the most dangerous thing here? It's that women themselves start to believe it. They learn to modulate their voice, lower their volume, choose words carefully, not because they no longer feel, but because they fear those emotions will make them seem problematic. The stronger the feeling, the greater the fear of being labeled. And so, they begin to play a role, the agreeable woman, the polite woman, the mature woman. But there is one unavoidable truth. Repressed emotions don't disappear. They just change shape. Where does unexpressed anger go? It coils inside, like a caged animal, waiting for a chance to lash out, or worse. It morphs into anxiety, depression, those quiet pains of the body. They no longer erupt in anger, but their bodies tense, their minds tire. They struggle to breathe in situations where they must keep holding it in. And strangely, at those moments, society praises them. She's so composed. She's strong, knows how to control herself. But those who praise her have no idea that, inside, she is slowly forgetting what it feels like to live true to herself. Some women, throughout their lives, turn silence into a part of their identity. They can stand before an insult, a blatant injustice, and still smile and say, it's okay, not because they aren't hurt, but because they've been taught that if they react, they're the ones in the wrong. And this begins with the smallest things. When a little girl squeals in delight, adults remind her, quiet now. Girls should be gentle. When she sulks over a slight injustice, they smile and say, it's nothing to get upset about. Each time, an invisible layer of armor is built, disconnecting her from her true feelings. She no longer knows how to distinguish between what feels right and what should feel right. By the time she's grown, that silence is no longer a choice. but a reflex. Faced with hurtful words, she hesitates. Faced with workplace injustice, she chooses silence. When someone crosses her boundaries, she tells herself, "Maybe I'm overthinking." And after it all, she blames herself for not responding and continues to suppress. The world looks at that woman and sees an ideal model, gentle, restrained, never causing trouble. But what doesn't the world see? It doesn't see the tension building in her chest, the sleepless nights from words left unspoken, the tears shed in silence, the unexplained headaches doctors can't diagnose. And what does society do? It praises those women, praises their resilience, praises their restraint. They are taught that anger is something to hide, something to control. They learn that to be loved, they must be soft, agreeable, good, and so they become people who live in two worlds, outwardly calm, inwardly burning with a fire never given a name. But what is even more dangerous, it's that they begin to forget they have the right to feel angry. That anger is a natural response when boundaries are crossed. That silence isn't always noble, but sometimes a trap that pulls them away from themselves. This taught silence, which seems to offer safety, is actually the prison that holds their true voice captive. And the world out there, where everyone says women should be gentle, is exactly the place where women lose their connection to themselves the most. It's not their anger that's dangerous. It's not being allowed to feel that anger that is truly dangerous. 2. The transformation of anger from repressed emotion to chronic anxiety. Anger never truly disappears. When unacknowledged and unreleased, it doesn't just evaporate into thin air, it finds another path to exist, creeping into the hidden corners of the mind, taking refuge within the body. And there, it transforms from a clear, recognizable emotion into more elusive states, anxiety, tension, depression, lingering fatigue without any clear cause. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, the unconscious, the rejected part within each person. For women, that shadow often takes the form of repressed anger, of intense emotion society teaches them to suppress. Jung warned, what we repress in the unconscious never truly goes away, it simply waits for a chance to resurface, often disguised as a psychological crisis, or even as a physical illness. And so, anger, when not allowed to be fully lived, begins its transformation. It doesn't scream or smash things as we might imagine. Instead, it silently morphs into anxiety. Not explosive anxiety, but the kind that drips slowly, chronically, embedded in every cell, leaving a woman in a constant state of vigilance, always ready to brace for the worst. This is when she walks into a room and instinctively scans every glance, every facial expression, analyzing whether she's making anyone uncomfortable. This is when, after every conversation, she spends hours replaying it in her mind, wondering if she said too much or came across too strongly. This is when, just before voicing something important, her heart races, her palms sweat, not from the intensity of the moment, but from the fear of being judged as too sensitive or too aggressive. That anxiety becomes a reflex, because when anger isn't allowed to surface, the body learns to hold it in. The nervous system slowly programs itself to avoid confrontation, to prevent tension, but avoiding confrontation doesn't mean peace. Avoiding confrontation means staying in a state of constant readiness, a prolonged hypervigilance that breeds anxiety. Jung called this the shadow speaking. When instinct is repressed, it doesn't die, it lives within us like an undercurrent, spinning the mind into cycles of questioning. Was I wrong? Was I too much? Should I stay silent? Women in this state aren't weak. They are simply those who have learned to live disconnected from their raw emotions for too long. But the body doesn't forget. The body carries the memory of all the times it was silenced, all the swallowed tears, all the moments she wanted to scream but instead smiled and let it go. That memory is etched in every muscle, every joint, every unexplained backache, every sleepless night, every vague fatigue. Repressed anger becomes a form of stuck energy. It doesn't disappear, it transforms into repetitive negative thoughts, into endless worry. Women in this state aren't just physically tired, they're emotionally drained, because they're constantly managing themselves, continuously adjusting their emotions to fit the expectations of others. The more repressed the anger, the deeper it embeds itself into the nervous system, paralyzing the fight or flight response. Instead of facing conflict, women learn to soothe others, to yield, to mediate, but what is the cost? They lose the ability to recognize when they need to protect themselves. They confuse maintaining peace with abandoning their boundaries. They blur the line between making others comfortable and leaving themselves behind. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." This is true for the buried anger within. When we don't confront it, women let that emotion silently dictate their behavior, the way they treat themselves, and they come to believe that it's just their nature, that they are naturally anxious, overly sensitive, easily overwhelmed. But that's not their nature. That's the result of a system that taught them to suppress their emotions until it twisted into anxiety. And so, they become the high-functioning women, the ones who seem fine, who get things done, who are always ready to help others. But inside, they're burning out, they're trapped in a cycle. The more they strive to please others, the further they drift from themselves. The more they worry about keeping everything in balance, the more unbalanced they become. Anger was never the enemy. It's a warning signal, the fire that sets boundaries, that keeps one safe. When women aren't allowed to feel and express that anger, they lose their internal compass, their connection to themselves. Chronic anxiety is simply repressed anger twisted into another form, silent, persistent, and corrosive from within. As long as anger is viewed as a dangerous emotion to avoid, women remain trapped in the anxiety loop. Jung didn't teach us to destroy the shadow. He taught us to face it, to recognize it, to integrate it into ourselves. And for women, that shadow is the anger they've been taught to fear their entire lives. Free. The role of the good woman, the cost of being pleasant. No one says it outright, but every girl quickly realizes the role society expects her to play. The role of the good woman, gentle, agreeable, always knowing how to make others feel comfortable. She listens more than she speaks, is always ready to empathize, to forgive, and never causes trouble. She doesn't demand, doesn't complain, doesn't burden anyone with her excessive emotions. It's a beautiful role, but it's also a trap that keeps many women locked in an invisible exhaustion. The cost of always being pleasant is far from cheap. It requires women to shrink, not just their words, but their emotions, desires, and needs. They learn to anticipate others' feelings, to adjust themselves in advance to keep everyone else at ease. They become masters of people-pleasing, but drift further and further away from themselves without even realizing it. The problem is, the better a woman becomes at making others feel comfortable, the harder it is for anyone to see what she really feels, because she herself gradually loses the ability to recognize it. In life, she becomes someone praised for her patience, for never making a fuss, for keeping the peace, but no one asks how she feels as she endures all of that. On the surface, this role looks like the perfect shield. Women are celebrated by society as dutiful, gentle, self-sacrificing, but inside, the cost is alienation from their true emotions, the sacrifice of themselves in conversations, relationships, and important decisions. Women play the role of the agreeable not because they feel nothing, but because they've been taught that their feelings must be suppressed to keep everything around them stable. Carl Jung called this the sacrifice of the ego, the authentic part, the I am meek part of each person. When the ego is suppressed to fit the role of the good woman, it doesn't disappear, it retreats, making room for pleasantness, but it keeps a silent record of every time it's ignored, every time it's forced into silence, every time it must yield. And what is repressed for too long finds its way back, not as clear emotions, but as anxiety, exhaustion, even depression. That's why so many women live in a state of high functioning. They excel at work, care for others, handle everything smoothly, but when the doors close, when there's no one left to serve, they feel empty, drained, directionless. No one sees this, because the role of the good woman is played too perfectly. It hides all the cracks within, but the problem isn't just that the woman plays this role. The more dangerous trap is that she begins to believe it is who she is. That she must be pleasant, must endure, must smile even when she's screaming inside. Because society has taught her, being pleasant is the path to being loved. So every time she wants to speak something difficult, to express her anger, to set a boundary, fear rises immediately. Am I being unreasonable? Will people distance themselves from me? And fearing she'll be labeled a bad woman, she continues the role, continues being pleasant, but the cost of always being pleasant is losing connection with oneself. She no longer recognizes what she truly wants, what she's doing just to please others, and over time, that disconnection leaves her feeling hollow, unable to connect with the deeper values within. Carl Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And for the women playing the agreeable role, that darkness is the buried anger, the unacknowledged discontent, the boundaries crossed without ever being defended. Liberation from that role is not rebellion or opposition. It is starting to listen to the inner voice again. To dare ask, what do I really want? What makes me feel hurt, offended, and more importantly, to allow herself to express those feelings, whether anger, sadness, or disappointment, with honesty. Because the role of the good woman doesn't just make women pleasant to others. It keeps them away from themselves. And the cost of that pleasantness is a poor inner life, is anxiety, is a nameless fatigue that only those who've lived it understand. 4. The awakening. When anger becomes a guide, there comes a moment, though small, fleeting, buried beneath years of repression, when a woman realizes her anger is not the enemy. It is not a monster to be locked away, not a weakness to be erased, but a signal, a guide, a whisper from her instincts, from the deepest part of her being, saying, something is not right, something needs to change. This awakening rarely arrives gently. It doesn't surface in moments of calm when everything is running smoothly. It comes in an eruption when the body can no longer hold on. When the final drop spills the cup, maybe it's a small argument with a loved one, a thoughtless comment from a coworker, another instance where someone crosses the boundary she has tried to set but hasn't dared to hold firm. And then, instead of swallowing it like every other time, the anger rises. For the first time, she doesn't extinguish it immediately. For the first time, she pauses and asks herself, why am I so angry? And there, within that flame, she finds the answer. She is angry because she has allowed others to repeatedly overstep her limits. She is angry because she has stayed silent too long, compromised too much, abandoned herself in conversations just to keep the peace. Carl Jung once said, anger is the most legitimate emotion when boundaries are violated. But how many women have been taught that? Instead, they've been taught that anger is a sign of weakness, of lack of control, of being too much. So, instead of listening to their anger, they ignore it, or worse, they turn against it, turning it into guilt, into shame. But when anger is no longer seen as the enemy, it becomes the guide. It tells a woman something in her life is misaligned, is in need of correction. Awakening begins with accepting anger as an essential part of herself. No more running, no more denial. Instead, she asks, what is making me feel this way? And the answers are always clearer than we expect. It might be broken promises, crossed boundaries, ignored desires. Jung also spoke of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we reject or hide because we fear they won't be accepted by society. For women, that shadow often holds their anger, their assertiveness, their desire to set boundaries. But the shadow doesn't disappear just because we ignore it. It remains, waiting. And when a woman dares to face that shadow, she doesn't just reclaim her anger, she reclaims herself, whole and original. The first step of awakening is recognizing the moments of anger we suppressed. It's allowing ourselves to recall the times we felt wronged but smiled it away. It's looking directly at the times we wanted to say no but nodded yes instead. It's listening to that inner voice, the one buried beneath the mask of being agreeable. And then, from recognition comes permission. Permission to feel the anger without rushing to extinguish it. Permission to let the anger speak, even if it starts only as a whisper in the mind. I am not okay with this. I have the right to be angry. In granting this permission, women begin to reconnect with themselves, with their needs, their desires, the things they once buried to please others. When listened to, anger does not lead to destruction as we might fear. It leads to clarity. It allows women to redraw the boundaries that have been blurred, to reclaim space for themselves, to reaffirm their worth. Anger becomes a tool, not to harm others, but to protect oneself. Awakening also means daring to change relationships, because when a woman begins to voice what she once repressed, not everyone will accept it. Some relationships were built on the foundation that she stays silent, that she yields. When she changes, those relationships must either adapt or end, and though painful, that is a necessary cleansing. The final step of awakening is walking alongside anger, not confronting or fleeing from it, but learning to move with it, knowing when anger is protecting us, when it needs to be voiced, when it guides us toward action. As Jung said, we do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious, and in this case, that darkness is the anger. When a woman steps out of the role of the good woman and lets anger become her guide, she does not become ruthless or unfeeling. She becomes more honest, more clear, more connected to herself. She is no longer agreeable to please others, she is agreeable to herself. And that is true liberation. 5. The rise of the true self, from silence to truth. When a woman dares to step beyond the shell of silence, beyond the role of the good woman, she begins to face something larger than anger, her true self. A part of her that has always been there, quietly observing, quietly waiting for the day it could speak. This is the part she once buried deep in her subconscious, once avoided because she believed it was too fierce, too uncontrollable, too difficult for others to love. Carl Jung once said, "The self you deny will always be waiting for you where you least expect it." This is why, after years of living in a role, when anger is finally heard, when boundaries are slowly re-established, a woman begins to feel more clearly the presence of her true self, the part that doesn't compromise, doesn't please others just to be loved, but the part that is honest, clear, and whole. This rising doesn't happen loudly. It doesn't need to shout, doesn't need to demand attention. Instead, it weaves itself into the smallest moments, when she chooses not to over-explain a simple decision, when she says no without cushioning it with reasons to soothe others, when she holds silence without feeling the need to fill the space with apologies. That true self had once been forced to step back, to make room for the role of the good woman, the one who is agreeable, who pleases, who doesn't make anyone uncomfortable. But at some point, that role becomes too confining. She begins to realize that this agreeableness comes at the cost of her truth, her joy, her connection to her real feelings. The rise of the true self is the journey back to herself. And the remarkable thing is, that self is not perfect, it is not polished, it is not the ideal image that society demands. It can be tough, rough around the edges, unrefined, but it is real, and that is where its power lies. Along this journey, there is a very clear turning point, when she stops trying to make others comfortable by betraying herself. When she understands that true harmony cannot be achieved by self-sacrifice. That harmony must come from truth, from both sides being allowed to be themselves. The rise of the true self also brings changes that not everyone will welcome. Some relationships that once seemed solid begin to shake when she is no longer as accommodating. Those accustomed to her always saying yes, always yielding, begin to feel she is different. She no longer fears standing alone, no longer feels guilty for putting her needs above others' comfort. Jung once said, "One cannot mature without facing their inner darkness." But that darkness is not just fear or wounds, it is also the true self that has been suppressed for too long. When she dares to look at it, she not only accepts the rougher parts of herself but also recognizes that real strength lies in daring to live truthfully, even if that truth makes others uncomfortable. This rising is not mere rebellion, it is a return. She returns to her original self, where feelings are not distorted, where her voice is not edited, where she is allowed to be herself without needing anyone's permission. And then, in the most ordinary moments, when she refuses an unwanted meeting, when she voices dissatisfaction she once would have swallowed, she feels a new freedom. A strange lightness from no longer carrying the old role, no longer holding onto the agreeable image others expect. Importantly, in this process, she does not become bitter or unfeeling. She becomes honest, honest with herself, with her emotions, with what she truly wants. She realizes that sometimes, making others uncomfortable is not a sin, it is a necessary part of living true to oneself. The rise of the true self does not mean abandoning softness, love, or care. On the contrary, it is the integration of all of it: anger, gentleness, strength, vulnerability, no longer needing to separate these parts, no longer acting to be loved, but living true, living whole. When the true self rises, the woman no longer needs external validation to know she is enough. She validates herself. She no longer waits to be accepted. she chooses to accept herself first. And that is the most enduring strength. 6. Anger is a compass, a guide to freedom. Anger, throughout a woman's journey, has long been seen as a negative emotion, something to control, something to hide in order to maintain harmony. But in the end, it becomes the guide, like a compass. Anger is not something to be eliminated, but something to be listened to, because it always points toward injustice, toward violation, toward boundaries that have been crossed without ever being confronted. In a world where women are taught to yield, to be agreeable, to prioritize others' comfort over their own needs, anger becomes a rare but powerful signal that something is wrong. It is the knock of truth, the alarm bell that says, this is the time for you to stand up for yourself. Carl Jung once said, the strongest emotions are where we have the most to learn. And anger, with all its weight and intensity, is the greatest lesson a woman who has been forced to suppress her emotions needs to relearn. It is not a destructive flame, it is an illuminating fire. Once she dares to stand within her anger, without judgment, without fear, she begins to uncover the message beneath it, that something needs to change, that a boundary has been crossed. In all those times she stayed silent, when she said, "It's okay, I'm fine," anger continued to burn quietly. It didn't disappear, it waited for the day she would be brave enough to hear its voice. And when she listens, she discovers that anger is not what makes her bad. On the contrary, it is the deepest part of her instincts, the part that knows she deserves respect, deserves protection. Anger says she is worthy of fairness, the boundaries being upheld. The sad thing is, women have been taught too many ways to hide their anger instead of listening to it. They learn to turn anger into anxiety, into exhaustion, into tension. But when anger is welcomed back, when it is no longer seen as the enemy, it becomes an ally. It leads her to reclaim what has been lost, her voice, her boundaries, her truth. Imagine a woman walking into a room, and instead of adjusting herself to fit everyone around her, she listens to the sensations in her body. When anger rises, she doesn't push it away but asks, "What here is not right for me?" And from there, she acts, not to harm others, but to protect herself. That is the power of anger when used correctly. It does not lead to reckless outbursts. It leads to intentional, informed action, a firm no spoken aloud, a request clearly articulated, a boundary set and maintained. These are the results of listening to anger. Anger also teaches her to love herself more fully, because when she knows she deserves to be protected and respected, she begins to treat herself with compassion and understanding. She no longer forces herself to be soft all the time. She allows herself to be firm when necessary. She allows herself to step away from relationships or situations that do not honor her value. As Jung once said, we do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Anger, when suppressed, is that darkness, but when illuminated, when understood and embraced, it becomes guiding light. It helps her see clearly what to hold onto and what to release. Especially when anger is acknowledged, other emotions become clearer too. Joy is no longer overshadowed by exhaustion. Sadness is no longer numbed into paralysis. Relief arises when she realizes she doesn't have to control everything, she just needs to listen to herself. And then, in that journey, she learns something vital. Anger does not separate her from the world. On the contrary, it connects her to herself, and from there, connects her to the world more authentically. Because when she lives truly, she can love truly, she can connect truly. Anger, with all its primal power, is not something to fear or avoid. It is the compass, guiding her back to herself, back to freedom, back to a life where she no longer needs permission to simply be who she is. 3 secrets to releasing anger and reconnecting with yourself. Secret 1. Anger is data, not a threat. Most of us were taught from a young age that anger is ugly, something to hide or control. Especially for women, anger is labeled as too much, difficult, unpleasant. But this is the greatest misunderstanding about this emotion. Anger, in reality, is a signal. It's not the problem, it's data. Think about it this way. When your body is injured, pain appears immediately. Pain isn't the problem, it's the reminder that you need to pay attention. Without it, you could continue hurting yourself without knowing. Anger is just like that. It signals that a boundary has been crossed, that something is wrong, that your needs are being ignored or your values are being threatened. But unlike physical pain, anger is burdened with negative meanings. We aren't taught to listen to anger as a signal, we're taught to avoid it, deny it, or soothe it so others feel comfortable. This keeps us from realizing that anger holds important truths about what we need and deserve. Carl Jung once said, "What you resist persists and returns as fate." When you don't allow anger to show up, it doesn't disappear. It finds another way to express itself, as anxiety, as dissatisfaction, as long-lasting emptiness. The more you ignore these signals, the louder they become, because they're only trying to tell you something needs to be addressed. Think back to the recent moments you felt irritated, maybe when someone interrupted you, when a coworker dismissed your efforts, when a loved one minimized your feelings. Your first reaction may have been, "I'm overreacting," or "I need to calm down." But instead of suppressing it, try pausing and asking, what is this anger trying to protect? What value of mine is being challenged? What need of mine is being ignored? That is valuable data. When you dare to listen to anger, it becomes a tool to help you understand yourself better. It helps you identify what's important to you, where your boundaries need to be set. It helps you uphold your self-respect and protect your emotional safety. This is why so many women fall into the cycle of chronic anxiety. They were taught that expressing anger would hurt others or make them seem bad in the eyes of the world. They don't allow themselves to express it, and in doing so, they lose the ability to recognize what they truly need. Anger, unable to speak, turns into tension, into self-doubt, into the constant need to hold it all together for the sake of harmony. This doesn't mean you had to explode or scream every time you feel angry. But ignoring anger isn't the solution either. Listening to anger is like checking a flashing red warning light on your car's dashboard. You might not fix it immediately, but if you ignore it, the consequences can become much worse. So what is the first step? It's allowing anger to exist without judgment, without labels. When you feel angry, instead of trying to shut it down, tell yourself, "This feeling is trying to tell me something." Write it down, reflect on it, sit with it for a few minutes. That's how you turn anger from a threat into useful data. Only when you treat anger as an ally can you understand where it's trying to guide you. It doesn't come to harm you. It comes to help you realize that you deserve respect, that you have the right to say no, that you don't need to stay silent just to be accepted. And when that happens, anger is no longer the enemy. It's a guide, leading you back to yourself. Secret 2. Never show the whole picture. One of the most dangerous things many people, especially women, do unconsciously in their effort to be understood is giving away too much too soon. Too fully, too vulnerably. We are taught that to build connection and trust, we must open up, share, and lay bare our thoughts, feelings, and wounds. But few ever tell you that limitless openness is also how you lose your power in relationships. The truth is, people do not cherish what they see too easily, too quickly, too clearly. When you show someone the entire picture, your emotions, your pain, your deepest thoughts, you aren't just giving them your truth, you're handing them control over your emotions. They know what hurts you, what makes you weak, what you fear, and in the hands of those lacking sensitivity or genuine care, that information becomes a tool to manipulate, to pressure, to keep you in a position of vulnerability. Carl Jung spoke about the shadow, the dark part within every person, where emotions and desires are repressed or deemed unacceptable. But Jung also pointed out that this shadow holds some of our most powerful energy. And if you rush to expose every corner of that shadow, you don't just lose the strength that comes from owning it, you open the door for others to step in and control it. Look back at the relationships where you felt hurt. How many times was it because you gave away too much information too soon? How many times did you share your pain, your fears, your deepest hopes, only to realize the other person didn't know how, or didn't want to keep them safe? They may even have used what you shared to hurt you further. This doesn't mean you had to close yourself off or never share. But sharing is an art. You don't always need to reveal everything. Not everyone deserves to see the entirety of who you are. Here's a simple but incredibly effective rule. Share based on safety, not on the need to be understood. Give a little, observe their reaction, and then decide whether to give more. Keep for yourself a space, a sacred part that only you know, because mystery is a form of power. When others can't fully figure you out, they can't fully control you. When you hold back the important parts for yourself, you retain your agency. your freedom, not out of fear, but because you know your worth doesn't lie in being completely understood by others. It lies in understanding and mastering yourself. Not letting anyone see the whole picture is a way to protect your inner strength. It doesn't mean being fake or creating a cold distance. It means setting boundaries. Preserving a private space for yourself where you can breathe, adjust your emotions, and listen to yourself before anyone else has the chance to define you. Remember, you can be honest without being fully exposed. You can share without giving everything away. You can connect while still keeping something for yourself. In that space, the part no one else can grasp, is where your freedom and strength reside. Secret 3. Make others want what you want. There's a truth that few ever teach you. Forcing someone is never as effective as making them choose willingly. To get someone to do what you want, the easiest way isn't to convince, argue, or pressure them into changing their mind. The strongest way is to make them believe it was their idea all along. This might sound like manipulation, and yes, it is, but manipulation isn't necessarily bad if you use it to steer toward truth. Protect boundaries, or achieve outcomes that benefit both parties. For centuries, those who hold real power, from politicians and leaders to schemers behind the scenes, have understood one thing: people will fight for what they desire but retreat when pressured by others. That's why the art of making others choose willingly is the key to influence. How does that happen? Offer choices. All roads lead to you. Never say, "I want you to do this." Instead, present 2 or 3 diverse-looking options, all of which benefit you. When they choose, they feel empowered, as if they control the decision, but in reality, you're the one guiding the direction. Awaken their needs, then link them to your goal. People act not out of logic but out of emotions and personal needs. Instead of speaking about what you want, speak to what they need: security, recognition, a sense of importance. When you align your desire with their benefit, they will act without feeling coerced. Plant ideas, let them germinate. Don't rush to get someone's agreement immediately. Instead, voice your idea as a question, a suggestion, or a simple comment for them to ponder. Then, let time do the rest. An idea planted at the right moment will linger in their mind. And when they accept it as their own, they'll pursue it. Carl Jung spoke of guiding the unconscious. If you want deep influence, reach the unconscious, not the rational mind. When you awaken feelings or unmet needs in others, even those they aren't consciously aware of, you touch a place reason cannot control. From there, you don't need to command. They will move toward it naturally. Think back to the times you've been drawn into something. Was it because someone forced you, or because you felt like the decision was yours? That's exactly this art. Apply this in relationships too. Instead of arguing, understand what the other person needs: security, freedom, a sense of being understood, and shape your message so it intersects with that need. When you stop fighting to be understood and start speaking the emotional language of others, they naturally shift toward your direction. But remember, this art requires patience and subtlety. You don't push, you don't control, you guide. And sometimes, staying silent, asking one question, and stepping back is enough to lead someone to you. This is power without form, silent, persistent, but highly effective. And then, once you've walked this path, from silence to understanding, from suppression to liberation, you will realize that anger was never the enemy. It was never what made you weak or too much. On the contrary, anger is the most honest part of you. It is the natural response when your boundaries are crossed, when your values are denied, when you are suffocated inside the role others want you to play. When you listen to your anger, you don't become aggressive, you become clear. When you allow it to speak, you don't destroy everything, you restore balance. Carl Jung once said that darkness does not disappear when we deny it. It only dissolves when we have the courage to face it. Your anger is the same. It doesn't need to be extinguished. It needs to be heard, understood, and guided. And when that happens, when you pause, hold your head high, and speak your truth, not yelling, not apologizing, just being honest, that is the moment you reclaim power. Not power over the outside world, but power over yourself. No more acting, no more being the agreeable woman. Just you, authentic, whole, unapologetically who you are. This journey back to your inner voice might not be easy. You might lose some people along the way, but what you gain, the freedom and the true sense of self, is something that cannot be traded for anything.